Canada's relationship with the U.S. has seen its challenges over the past 4 years, and there have been some tense political moments.
Canadians were polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
Well, he's two-faced.
Now, during this unprecedented time, the federal government is preparing for the possibility of even more uncertainty.
We won't be commenting on possible outcomes. Our responsibility as a government is to prepare for different eventual outcomes.
Either outcome will be significant for Canada. We have spent a lot of time carefully analyzing what either outcome would mean.
Okay, so what does that preparation look like, and what would a Trump or Biden presidency mean for Canada? It's Thursday, and I'm here with At Issue, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. All right, let's start with what we could imagine or what we know might be happening behind the scenes in terms of that preparation for those outcomes. Althea, I'll start with you on that one.
Well, they are preparing, as the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister said, for every potential outcome. The outcome that they have spent less time preparing for is the possibility that the winner is unknown for a long time. If that is the case, they are still going to start lobbying efforts to new members of Congress, for example, new Democrats talking about things that are important to Canada, possibly like Keystone and climate. Risks that they've identified, like Buy American provisions that the Biden camp has talked about. So, with Biden, we actually know what to expect. With Trump, there is no platform. What they are expecting is basically more of the same, which is the possibility, like racing for the unknown, right? We do know that there is the question mark over the aluminum tariffs that would come about a week and a half after the election, which may still come if the president decides that we have breach the self-imposed quotas that he's put on us, regardless of what the outcome is. But the relationship and the preparation involved with this election, and is far more intense than it was in 2016. There was very little preparation that Donald Trump was going to win.
Let's talk a little bit about how the presidency sort of altered the state of the Trudeau first mandate and now into the beginning of their second. I mean, it changed the way they had to approach governing. Is that fair to say, Chantal?
I'm not sure about governing, but for sure renegotiating NAFTA was not on the horizon over the campaign that led to the first Liberal victory. And then the unpredictability, which means that the government went from the best to worst. Best because the bromance issue with Barack Obama was real, and worse because the unpredictability that has been the feature of the past 4 years. Now, I would say that privately it's hope for the best, and the best is definitively not a Trump victory, and prepare for the worst, and the worst is not a Trump victory. It's uncertainty.
Sure.
And the possibility that someone in the White House starts saying, we want you to acknowledge that I've won before it's clear that this person has won, and vice versa. So it's possible to prepare in the sense of no one celebrating unless the result is clear. But I think it's the Canadian government is bracing for, if the result is not decisive, for a difficult 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, everyone that I've spoken to, Andrew, has said that they will do sort of what they should do in those circumstances, and that is to keep their mouth shut. But Chantal's right. If there's some sort of pressure coming, a civil unrest or pressure from inside the White House, that becomes difficult.
Yeah, I mean, the premise we have to operate under is that Donald Trump cannot contemplate being ejected from the White House. He can't contemplate it psychologically because it just doesn't fit with his view of himself. But more importantly, perhaps, he can't contemplate it from a legal standpoint. He's got mounting legal difficulties, criminal and otherwise, that he's been able to stave off so long as he's in the Oval Office, but he would not be able to do as a private citizen. And he has simply no scruples about doing whatever he has to do to try to cast the result in doubt, even a clear result, frankly. So, frankly, the idea of gridlock and uncertainty is the best case scenario in that event. When you look at the fervency of his following, the fact that they believe everything he says, the fact that a good number of them are armed, there's no wonder why some of the states are now talking about calling up the National Guard. So there is real prospect for some very tumultuous times ahead. If he does manage to beat the odds and wins the election outright, or emerges from that process as the winner, then you're looking at, I mean, Althea called it more of the same, but more of the same is vindicating himself on his enemies, revenging himself on his enemies, padding his expense account, enriching himself, and causing more and more uncertainty for the rest of the world, if only because he's going to be facing a Congress that will be determined to try to rein him in, just as he's determined to enjoy his last 4 years in power. So it's a really nightmare scenario either way.
Well, and potentially a president who is really going to pull down the institutions that he's spent a lot of time eroding, and he'll pull them down over the next 4 years. Let's just talk about Joe Biden a bit, because that is not a cakewalk either. And I think that Canadians need to be aware of that a little bit, Althea, what the challenges that a President Biden could bring and whether they can be overcome. What do you think, Althea?
Top of the list is Keystone. He said that he is opposed to the plan. Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, has talked about building a sort of a Team Canada approach, much like what was used with NAFTA, to try to sell this project. So that's clearly on the government's mind. Maybe less, not quite as intense as NAFTA, but still pretty intense. Buy American provisions, which were a challenge, frankly, under President Obama as well. The idea that even when it comes to climate, for example, where there is opportunity where Canadian firms might be able to compete, that we would be shut out of that. Climate is a two-edged sword. It's great because the Liberal government is very simpatico with potential Joe Biden administration on that issue, but also more competition might not necessarily be great for Canadian firms. There is the potential of clean hydro, though. The U.S. president has said he wants to be carbon-free, the electricity grid to be carbon-free by 2035. He wants to re-engage in world institutions like the World Health Organization, like the UN. These are all good things for Canada, the WTO. So yes, there is opportunity, but there is a lot of risk.
Is there more of one than the other, do you think, Chantal?
It's impossible to put another 4 years of Trump on one side and Biden on the other, and to just do this balancing act.
Sure.
It would be great for Keystone XL if Trump is reelected. That involves normalizing the Trump presidency. And if anyone wants to do that after 4 years, count me out. So yes, there will be hurdles, but normalization, that's like telling Canadians, can we go back to life before the pandemic? Yes, it was full of hurdles, but it was something that you could seize control on. It's called normality. And on the scale of the hurdles, and there are always hurdles in a relationship, normality trumps all.
So all those challenges that Althea so well outlined there,
they're
Andrew,
all real.
Yeah, they're all real, but they're all manageable, Andrew, I guess is the point. Is that right?
They're the kind that we're accustomed to. So, yeah, I'm in the cakewalk camp, frankly, on relative terms. There are always going to be some issues. There are under Republican or Democratic presidents, softwood lumber, and so on.
Yeah.
But you cannot put a price on having a normal human being in the White House with normal responses to, the usual events that come up between countries, so that you're not having to engage in this kind of psychoanalysis of just, how will he overreact this time? Will it have anything to do with any rational calculation of U.S. State interests, or will it just be because he's in a fit of pique because somebody didn't flatter him enough? So having a president, even a president who wasn't as simpatico in ideological terms with the current government, would obviously be, a president who was more like a normal president would obviously be a huge gain, not only for the Liberal government, but for the country as a whole. I will say also that some of Biden's policies, for example, reversing the Trump tax cuts on corporations and upper income individuals, will take some of the competitive pressure off of Canada as well.
Sure. I don't have long, but let me ask something a little more provocative. Do you think, though, that a Trump presidency has allowed Justin Trudeau to appear differently on the world stage, or has allowed him to take up a place there that maybe wouldn't have been possible with a different kind of president? Just quickly from all of you, Althea.
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you recall back to 2016, he was still on this honeymoon. The world loved him. He was in Vanity Fair, going to Davos. I think what happened was they got consumed with renegotiating NAFTA, and that sucked the wind out of everything.
Right.
And so I'm not sure that the compare and contrast really has benefited the prime minister, frankly. But I will say, though, that I don't think the relationship is as dysfunctional as it may appear publicly. Like, we do know that Katie Telford, the prime minister's chief of staff, is still in contact with Jared Kushner,
Right.
that the prime minister called the president when he had COVID to, wish him a swift recovery. Things are actually operating. You just look at the border as a perfect example that, yeah, despite the tweets and the drama that the president is addicted to, things actually have been functioning pretty decently.
Okay, Chantal?
But that's on Justin Trudeau and his government, I guess, because
Yeah.
it's certainly not on Donald Trump. I agree with Althea. Canada shines when multilateralism shines, and it's been the opposite of that.
Andrew?
I think he's benefited domestically by comparison with Trump. For example, we have not done a particularly good job on fighting the pandemic in this country. You can mix blame between the federal government and the provinces on that, but compared to a lot of other countries, we haven't done that well. We've done very well compared to the United States, and our tendency in this country is always to measure ourselves relative to the south of the border rather than looking further afield. So having somebody so manifestly unfit for office in the White House has certainly been to the benefit of Justin Trudeau in terms of people's estimation of his policies and performance.
All right, let's move on to another topic. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland spoke at the Toronto Global Forum earlier this week, where she talked about the federal government's spending during the pandemic. All of this ahead of an expected fall fiscal update later in November. Here's some of what Chrystia Freeland had to say.
For Canadians of a certain vintage, and I freely admit to being one of them, the idea of increasing government debt holds particular terrors. But it's a poor general who fights the last war. And the reality is that today, the prevailing global economic environment is changed entirely. Our fiscally expansive approach to fighting the coronavirus cannot and will not be infinite.
So what did you make of why that message was given, Andrew, and the message itself?
Well, it's good to know that she doesn't plan on infinite spending and infinite deficits, but we don't know a great deal about what limits, if any, she recognizes short of that. So there was a lot of talk about how, well, this isn't the 90s. This is a very popular theme these days. This isn't the 90s. People shouldn't be scared because, we're in a different time. And yeah, we're different in the sense that interest rates are now below the growth rate in the economy, whereas in the 80s and 90s they were above. But there's a cautionary note in that. Interest rates are so low, they're at historic lows, that they can only go up. And maybe they're not going to go up in the next year or 18 months, but at some point they're going to rise. Whereas the growth rate of the economy is much lower than it was in the 90s and is going to stay there for decades. So we had 4 or 5% real growth coming out of the 90s to help us conquer those deficits. We're looking at growth rates of 1.5% for years to come. So there was a kind of a note of complacency in there that I don't think is warranted. But we're not going to really know what they're doing until we see the fiscal update and the budget in terms of the hard numbers.
Yeah, it also came the same week, Chantal, where the Prime Minister said that fiscal anchors weren't going to really be mentioned in the fiscal update, i.e., debt to GDP ratio or keeping the deficit under whatever number. So it does seem as though they're sort of preparing Canadians, I guess, for the fact that things are going to be big and getting out of the situation, I guess, it doesn't seem to be urgent.
Well, I'm not sure that it doesn't seem to be urgent, but the fact is that the government doesn't really know what that second wave is going to mean and what the winter is going to be like. So up to a point, you're kind of in a black hole here. I think what they're mostly doing at this point is preparing for the headlines of the morning after the fiscal update. So no fiscal anchor, been there, done that. No end in sight to deficits. Been there, done that. It's mostly a defensive move. It's not necessarily a bad move, but I think it's preparing us for a fiscal update that will not really showcase a plan to restore the fiscal ship.
And I wonder if that's because they are feeling some pressure, either from the official opposition or elsewhere, that they do have to have some notion around, like some parameters around their spending, Althea, or I don't know. I'm just speculating here.
Well, it's a little crazy to think there hasn't been a budget since before the last election.
Yeah, more than
Like,
500
let that
days.
sink
Yeah, yeah.
for a while,
Yeah.
right? And so the fiscal update was basically just a snapshot in time. And they told us that the fiscal update was going to be like this fall was going to be that as well. But they did tell the MPs before the throne speech that there was going to be some sort of fiscal anchor. And I was speaking to somebody this week in the Prime Minister's office who said, oh, they must have misunderstood. There's going to be fiscal guardrails, guardrails,
guardrails,
but not
okay.
anchors. So,
Well,
you know, there
okay.
is definitely, there are certain people who are worried that the government is spending like drunken sailors. And now they're saying, one day we will get to shore. It's fine to spend at the moment. So there are managing expectations. I completely agree with Chantal on that front. I think that the public is generally on side with the government, especially people who
Yeah.
have lost their
Yeah.
job, people in the service sector. In fact, you know, people in the tourism sector are still worried that they feel like their industry has not gotten a fair shake from the government. So I think her arguments are fairly strong, but I think to those people who are very concerned that the government doesn't seem to have a plan, there was really not much in that speech that says the government does have a plan.
Well, I'll just
But
end
don't-
yeah. Go
don't-
ahead, Chantal. Yeah.
Don't forget, this is a government that is still thinking that it may have to fight an election before it has to
True.
come up with a full-fledged budget. So expect spending on some of the things in the throne speech, if only because if you're going to go in an election, you need to have shown that you plan to walk the talk of the throne speech.
It's also a government that is still looking for ways to help particular sectors, like the airlines, for instance, Andrew. And I wonder, to Althea's point, which I think is a good one, that Canadians aren't really concerned about this right now. I mean, maybe that's not an excuse for a government not to be concerned, but Canadians just want help, you know?
In the short term, yes, and there's exactly nobody opposed to that, okay?
Yeah.
There's absolute consensus that in terms of meeting a crisis where basically people were told they had to stay home and not work, that they should be compensated for that. The issue is going forward is there any attempt to try to get back to balance out of that, or do the government just say, okay, now that we've opened the vault, now let's spend on a lot of other programs that we've always wanted to do anyway, and we're now going to use this as the pretext for it. And I think the opposition is entitled to draw the line on that.
Okay.
And we'll see where the public is.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all. I appreciate it.